All was not well with Sylvester Stallone's career in the summer of 1995. Judge Dredd had come out, and despite blockbuster business overseas, the film flopped in the all-important North American market. It would kick off a dry spell in Stallone's career, with many of his follow-up movies also doing poorly, to the point that in the early 2000s, he was stuck doing low-rent movies that went direct-to-video, such as Shade and Avenging Angelo. Of course, a major comeback for the Italian stallion was just around the corner, but in this episode of Stallone Revisited, we look back at his follow-up to Judge Dredd, Assassins, which, on paper, should have been one of Sly's classics, but has gone on to become something of an obscure, underrated outing on his CV.
I beat you to the buyers. Now, I beat you to the mark. I'm sorry, but I think I picked the wrong guy to be my hero.
Who's your contractor, Miguelito?
Why don't you drive? We can get acquainted. Chit-chat.
In the 1990s, spec scripts were all the rage. For those who don't know, a spec script is when a writer completes an entire screenplay on their own and sells it to a major studio. In the 90s, writers like Shane Black and Joe Esterhaus sold their completed scripts for The Long Kiss Goodnight and Basic Instinct for millions of dollars. For a brief period, screenwriters became rock stars, and the Wachowskis, before they ever directed a frame, became two of the hottest writers in town when they sold not one but two spec scripts to mega producer Joel Silver for $1 million apiece. One was The Matrix, and the other was Assassins. Back in the 90s, Assassins was considered a very, very commercial screenplay, while The Matrix was considered very risky. But indeed, this one became a pricey flop despite seeming like a home run on the page. Indeed, the script had many interested parties, with Mel Gibson, then the king of action at Warner Brothers, originally interested in both directing and starring in the film before getting too busy with Braveheart and passing it along to his mentor, Richard Donner. Richard Donner, of course, was himself something of an icon, having directed The Lost Boys and the Lethal Weapon movies. The screenplay centered around a deadly game of cat and mouse between two rival hitmen, the older, experienced Robert Rath and the wild, deadly upstart Miguel Bain. Every big male actor in Hollywood at some point had their name in contention, with the Wachowskis maintaining that the part of Robert Rath had been designed for Sean Connery.
Retired, of course.
The idea was to make this a two-hander with two big stars in the roles, and indeed in 1995 the two leading men, Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas, were likely seen as a can't-miss prospect. At the time, Stallone was coming off of Cliffhanger and Demolition Man, while The Specialist had done pretty good business too. Judge Dredd hadn't actually hit theaters at this point.
The law doesn't make mistakes.
Meanwhile, Banderas' star was still rising, with his hit movie Desperado opening just a few months before Assassins finally did. Stallone and Banderas got along famously well, and they both loved the director, Richard Donner. Plus, they had rising star Julianne Moore playing the love interest.
Hey, be careful, partner.
What went wrong? If you read Richard Donner's authorized biography, he admits to a few things going wrong. For one thing, he did not hit it off with the Wachowskis one bit. The duo had written a graphically violent script that Donner had no interest in turning into a film, begging the question, why was he hired in the first place? Instead, he brought in writer Brian Helgeland to do a major rewrite which would make Stallone's Robert Rath a much more likable hero, and in a fatal move, he excised most of the action in the screenplay in favor of turning the film into more of a neo-noir rather than a high-voltage action movie, which it had been designed as. He wanted to put out a movie that would feature one of Stallone's best ever dramatic performances, proudly telling interviewers that in this one, Stallone would only kill two people, and only to save his life, begging the question, why make Stallone a hitman? Indeed, Donner toyed with the idea of making Robert Rath a cop, something the Wachowskis were not keen on, proving that in the end the director just did not mesh with the material, and tried hard to turn it into something that it just was never meant to be.
You're gunning slow. Antiquado.
I'm not the one shooting out mirrors, son.
Indeed, in Donner's book, it's mentioned that in post-production, all involved realized they had made a dull film, especially once they saw Luc Besson's The Professional.
If you leave your mouth, I pull the trigger, capisci?
That's why the original score by Michael Caine got ditched at the 11th hour in favor of a more action-driven score by Mark Mancina. The film was a box office flop, making under $30 million in North America, and indeed, when it opened, the trades were full of stories about how Stallone's star power had dimmed. Overseas, of course, the film was a lot more successful, as Stallone's star power was still going pretty strong, with it making an extra $50 million, meaning the film grossed about $83 million worldwide. It actually lost quite a bit of money, and Stallone's paycheck for the film had been a huge $15 million, and Hollywood at this point was wondering whether or not Stallone was still worth the massive paychecks.
You quit your job, you're having thoughts you never had before. Sounds like a midlife crisis to me.
So how does the movie hold up? While a lot of people watching this series have written me to say that they were looking forward to this episode, I never really loved Assassins as a movie. I don't mind it, but the late Richard Donner, who is one of my favorite directors, was not immune to misfires. He made a couple of really bad movies around this point, particularly Timeline, and I think that his conspiracy theory film is a bit of a mess.
You're telling me that NASA is going to kill the President of the United States with an earthquake.
Not exactly the kind of thing a Secret Service agent can, just throw himself on top of.
Heck, I don't even really like Lethal Weapon 4 all that much.
They're promoting you. Captain Riggs. Captain Murtaugh.
So this was not really his best period for movies. His effort to make it into a classy thriller out of what was probably always meant to be a gum-chewing action B-movie went wrong right off the bat with its pretentious, dull staging. Stallone dials it down a lot, too much so, to the point that he seems like he's depressed throughout the entire movie, which I guess his character is, but who wants to watch that on the screen? He's playing a world-weary hitman, emphasis on the weary, and I remember as a child watching this movie and just wishing that Stallone would lighten up a bit. I missed, the smiling Sly. Heck, even in Cobra, he smiles more than he does in this movie.
I'll kill her! I'll blow this whole place up!
Go ahead. I don't shock her.
His chemistry with the great Julianne Moore also isn't there, with her role as a hacker being targeted, with only Sly to protect her feeling shoehorned in. It's like Hollywood at the time just really was uncomfortable about making a movie that didn't have some kind of love interest. So, you get one, but their chemistry is non-existent. That said, the movie does have one significant saving grace, and that's Antonio Banderas. Despite being new on the scene, Banderas goes all out as far as scenery chewing goes.
I had to try. Who knows? Maybe it wasn't made in America. Whoa, 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 whoa.
And if the movie has a pulse at all, it's because of him. His wild, over-the-top performance has given birth to a lot of internet memes, but he's the one that emerged from the film with his star power intact, with him signing on to do The Mask of Zorro not long after. Indeed, Banderas and Stallone would reunite a couple of times, with them doing Spy Kids 3 together, and eventually The Expendables 3. Donner, in his later years, said that if he could do the film over again, he would have switched the roles, with Sly playing the bad guy and Banderas playing the hero, which, to be honest, might have actually been a lot better. In the end, it's pretty obvious why Assassins flopped, because even though it was marketed as an action flick, it was a psychological thriller, exactly the type of film Stallone's fans at the time didn't want to see him in. And while it's slickly made, I give it a 6 out of 10 Stallones. Never one of my favorites, although I do think that, there are good things about it. One would think that its failure would have driven Sly back to his action movie comfort zone, but his next film, Daylight, would be another attempt to stretch, with him diving into the disaster movie genre, which at the time was red hot at the box office in the wake of Twister. Sadly, its release would miss the trend by just a couple of months, but that's a story for another time.
It was very nice meeting you, Robert Ryan.
It's very dangerous meeting you, Miguel Caine.
1995 wasn't a good year for Sylvester Stallone at the multiplex. His big summer tentpole movie Judge Dredd flopped domestically, and it was quickly followed by Richard Donner's Assassins, which only grossed $30 million at the domestic box office. While Sly's career had weathered a few slumps, typically his straightforward action movies always performed relatively well, and the failure of those two movies put his clout as one of the world's biggest action stars in jeopardy. In this episode of Sylvester Stallone Revisited, we're going to talk about a movie that was supposed to be a big budget, commercial change of pace for the actor, but wound up being the last would-be blockbuster he'd star in for many years. That's right, we're going to talk about Rob Cohen's Daylight.
Get them to daylight. Don't let them die in this place. Here?
Flashback to the mid-90s. Sylvester Stallone had launched a major comeback with Cliffhanger and followed it up with two more global blockbusters, Demolition Man and The Specialist. In 1994, Stallone signed a deal for $20 million to star in a movie for an upstart new studio called Savoy Pictures. The movie was never made, but a new benchmark had been set for movie star salaries, with $20 million paydays suddenly the fee that all A-listers wanted. Stallone got a rich $17.5 million from Universal to star in Daylight, and before the film went in production, they signed him to a 3-movie deal for $60 million, which would mean $20 million apiece. But this film would underperform drastically, and the 3-movie deal would eventually expire, with Stallone only making a horror thriller for them called Detox, aka I See You, which would disastrously go direct-to-video, essentially ending his career as a movie star, for a while anyway. Like all legends, Sly would make a comeback, but in the late 90s, things were dire. To this day, Daylight remains an obscure title in Stallone's library. It was supposed to be a huge film, with Universal spending a rich $80 million to make it. One has to think that Stallone's fans, who were used to him killing bad guys at this point, were disappointed to see him as the lead in a movie where the body count happens independently of Stallone's fists. The movie was a part of an interesting mini-trend that happened in the mid-90s, where the old disaster film cycle was revived. Let me explain. In the 70s, before Jaws and Star Wars changed the blockbuster game, disaster movies were all the rage. Typically, these films revolved around horrible disasters and featured star-studded casts in melodramatic, soap opera-worthy roles. There was Airport, where travelers dumb enough to go up in an airplane piloted by the always drunk-looking Dean Martin pay the price and have to deal with a mad bomber.
You'll kill yourself or nothing if you explode that bomb.
Then there was The Poseidon Adventure, where Gene Hackman, as a turtleneck-wearing man of God, has to guide survivors through the wreckage of an overturned luxury liner.
I told you I was going to get everybody out of here, and damn it, I'm going to do it!
There's Earthquake, where Charlton Heston and George Kennedy have to deal with an apocalyptic quake in Los Angeles, and best of all, there was The Towering Inferno, where Paul Newman and Steve McQueen, in a star pairing for the ages, have to save the residents of an out-of-control fire in the world's tallest skyscraper.
Those people are going to die up there if something's not done.
The genre petered out when the premises began to get dumber, such as Michael Caine fighting killer bees in The Swarm, or Michael Caine, again, returning in Beyond the Poseidon Adventure to recover stolen uranium. By the time an embarrassed Paul Newman had to watch Rocky star Burgess Meredith walk a tightrope across an active volcano and when time ran out while Mr. Miyagi fell to his death, the genre was all but dead. But it came back in a big way in 1996, thanks to the year's 2 biggest movies, Twister and Independence Day. Only Twister was a true disaster movie, but ID4 used the star-studded melodramatic style of those films, with director Roland Emmerich still being a guy that's making movies in this genre many years later. He seems to be the specialist.
Being exterminated.
Suddenly, studios were greenlighting disaster movies left and right, including not 1 but 2 volcano movies, Dante's Peak and Volcano. The problem? All these disaster movies flopped, including Sly's entry, Daylight. In the movie, Sly plays Kit Latura. What a name. A former New York City emergency medical services chief now working as a taxi driver. During his commute, he witnesses a disastrous explosion that traps commuters in an underground tunnel that runs under the Hudson River, and it's about to collapse.
Okay, now talk to me. How many people are left alive down there?
Sly being Sly, he immediately jumps into action, reclaiming his old job with emergency services and undertaking a suicide mission where he enters the tunnel via its ventilation system to rescue the survivors. Sounds pretty cool, right? In some ways yes, in some ways no.
I know you've been through hell down here, I can see that, but I'm just asking you to be patient.
Daylight came out shortly before CGI started to dominate special effects, and some of the practical effects here are pretty incredible. The movie was shot at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, and they were able to flood the sets, set off explosions, and do a lot of really cool stuff. The explosion sequence that rips apart the tunnel is pretty nifty, as is a nail-biting moment where Kit has to get into the tunnel via a ventilation system where the fans are still moving. Sly's intensity is perfect, and you can see he relishes playing a more down-to-earth hero. Where the film goes wrong, though, is the non-action related stuff. Their director, Rob Cohen, made a few good movies in his time, including Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and the original The Fast and the Furious. But he tends to be very melodramatic, and Daylight, which is already going for a soapy vibe, gets pretty cheesy pretty fast.
Look, I don't know who you are, I don't know what you know and what you don't. All I know is I've got a 14-year-old daughter down here, and her life means more to me than anything. So I want to be involved in any decisions that are made down here. Am I clear, Mr. Latura?
You can tell The Poseidon Adventure was the movie they modeled this on, but the plot lines are embarrassingly dopey. First, there's the old couple who don't want to lose their dog.
Did you ever have a dog?
My mom's liked everything in the world except 2 things. Dogs and me.
Don't worry, the dog doesn't die, but one of them does. This is viewed as much less tragic than anything happening to a dog, though.
I thought she was rescued.
I'm sorry.
Then there's the unpredictable juvenile delinquents, one of whom is played by Sly's late son, Sage Stallone, who's decent enough in his performance. I always kind of like Sage.
Listen, if we don't die in here, I was wondering if maybe I could give you a call.
Then there's the estranged husband and wife trying to reconnect while dealing with their rebellious teen daughter, played by future scream queen Danielle Harris. There's Amy Brenneman as a struggling playwright with a lack of confidence who serves as Sly's default love interest. And the really melodramatic theme song, Whenever There Is Love, plays on the soundtrack, whenever the two make goo-goo eyes at each other. Her role was clearly patterned pretty heavily off of a similar part that Sandra Bullock played in Speed. There's even a young Viggo Mortensen as a daredevil businessman who tries to start his own rescue, but given his billing, fails miserably. Most of these plot lines are goofy, with one exception. Stan Shaw is actually really good as the nice guy transit cop who becomes Kit's second in command and wants to get back to his fiancée, who happens to be the tunnel operations manager and is watching the tragedy unfold remotely. He brings some depth and pathos to his part.
You just have to leave me.
No.
Yeah.
Don't listen to. We can make it.
Not with a broken neck.
George. I just need some time to figure it out. I just need some time.
Overall, though, this is pretty silly stuff, even if it is still kind of fun. It's not particularly well regarded by Stallone fans, and it had the misfortune to come out just as disaster movies were bombing left and right. It grossed an abysmal $33 million domestically, which seriously hurt Sly's career, even though it did well enough overseas that by the time it hit home video, it likely broke even. It was meant to be the beginning of a massive series of blockbusters for Sly, but it would prove to be his last action movie to get a wide release until Get Carter in 2000 and Driven in 2001. Both of which would do so badly that Stallone's career went into deep freeze for about half a decade. However, before that, he'd starred perhaps one of his best movies, Copland, where his performance in an atypical part would be so powerful that even his harshest critics would fall in line behind him. But that's a story for another time. I give this one a pretty middling 6 out of 10 Stallones.
You killed everybody else, but you know what? You should have killed me. Because I found your heart! I found your heart! And I'll blow it out of your body!
I'm gonna do something for you nobody ever did for me. I want to give you a second chance.
Copland was supposed to be Sylvester Stallone's big comeback movie. Despite earning decent box office and generating Sly's best reviews in decades, it seemed to actually be the final nail in his coffin as far as beating a leading man goes, and I don't understand why.
How do you think this looks?
Go on, Freddy.
Before Copland, Stallone was headlining huge action movies like Daylight and Judge Dredd, and while they underperformed domestically, overseas they were still pretty big.
Holy crud.
One would think that Stallone would have been given an old-school action film to revive his career. After all, it had worked in the past with Cliffhanger and Demolition Man.
Let's go blow this guy.
Away. Blow this guy away.
But all of a sudden, he was slotted into cheap movies, such as the slasher thriller Detox, which is also called ICU. And no, not I as in the letter, and C as in the letter, and U as in the letter. No, I as in I having an I, seeing C, and then you as in you and me. I see you. What a terrible, terrible title.
I see you, but you don't see me.
That movie was so bad that it wound up going direct to video, which pretty much meant the end of Stallone's career for a good half dozen years, until he managed a major comeback with Rocky Balboa.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
But it would get pretty dire for Sly in that intervening period, but Warner Brothers did produce 2 movies they gave theatrical releases to in 2000 and 2001, and both movies would be huge, huge flops, with Driven widely considered one of Stallone's worst film evers. But Get Carter, which came up before Driven, is actually a bit underrated. It's a remake of the classic Michael Caine gangster movie of the same name. We should stop right there because even if Get Carter at the time was mostly unknown in North America, in the UK the film was considered a stone-cold classic.
Are you coming in or are you going to piss about all day?
You're bloody finished, you know that, Jack? I've bloody finished you!
Not till I'm dead, Eric.
Thus, the knives were out for this one before it ever even hit theaters, and critics, it must be said, were seemingly looking to take Sly down a few more notches.
Come on. What do you want to do, boy? What do you want? Come on, cowboy. You want to get a rep? Come on. Take your best chance. Get a rep. Come on. Come on, shoot. You got the stuff?
Doing a remake was exactly the wrong thing for his career at the time, but the movie actually ain't half bad. It's interesting watching Get Carter in the wake of Stallone's success on Tulsa King, where he plays a gangster, because in that show he sports the same look that he does here in Get Carter. In it, he plays a mob enforcer who's in trouble with his boss, Tom Sizemore, in a voice cameo.
Which part of I can't let you go did you not understand? Jack, this is your job. This is not a frickin' charity case. You do your job.
Because he's been seeing his mistress, Audrey, played by Gretchen Mol in, you guessed it, another cameo, behind his back. While he should be laying low, he discovers that his brother has died in a car accident, and he returns to his old Seattle stomping grounds and discovers that his late brother was in fact murdered.
Your brother Richard's name was mentioned? Cyrus goes out with some very bad guys. And when he comes back, your brother's gone.
It turns out that his brother's daughter, Doreen, played by Rachel Lee Cook, who was just coming off of She's All That at the time, was drugged and raped and used against her will in a porn flick, and that when the brother tried to expose them, he was killed. Sly's Carter unleashes a world of hurt on the bad guys, and while the film is more of a serious noir-style drama than an action flick, as a Sly aficionado back in 2000, I remember thinking it was a pretty cool movie.
So now I gotta make it right. I gotta do that. I mean, what would you do if it was your daughter?
Nowadays, Get Carter holds up fairly well as a time capsule, with it very evocative of the kind of late 90s crime movies that were hip in the wake of Reservoir Dogs.
God damn you, Joe. Don't make me do this.
Larry, stop pointing that fucking gun at my dad!
While it ain't Tarantino, it fits in well alongside other examples of the genre like Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead, Suicide Kings, and The Way of the Gun. Director Stephen Kay, who later became a mainstay of Taylor Sheridan shows, directs this with a lot of style. Too much, perhaps, as you can really tell this is someone's first big studio movie and that they're showing off a bit. While people mocked that aspect of the film back in 2000, now it's kind of endearing, making the movie feel like a fun retro thriller with the soundtrack especially evocative of the era, with songs by Moby and Paul Oakenfold. It was also composer Tyler Bates' first big film, and he does a terrific job on the score, riffing on the original Get Carter theme song by Roy Budd. Another strong thing about Get Carter is the cast, with Miranda Richardson, Alan Cumming, and Rachel Lee Cook pretty prestigious at the time, while co-star Rhoda Mitra soon became an object of lust for a lot of guys going through their formative years at the time this came out.
I'll tell you something, if you lie to me, I'll break every... Listen to me. I want to break every beautiful bone in your body.
What's really special about Get Carter are the two actors they get to play the antagonists. First, there's the original Carter himself, Michael Caine, who they were able to entice to reteam with Stallone for the first time since Victory.
Listen, I don't like hard cases coming in here and talking to me like I know something. If there's someone out there putting out something about me, then I want to know who the hell it is. And when I know what it is and who's been saying it, I might just take the matter up with you, Jack.
This was a pretty big coup, as Caine being involved gave the film some legitimacy, and he had just won an Oscar for The Cider House Rules and was in the middle of a huge comeback.
Good night, you princes of Maine, you kings of New England.
The other really cool piece of casting was Mickey Rourke. At the time, Rourke's career was in the gutter, with him being mocked as box office poison, and being known more for being tabloid fodder than an actor.
You got my deepest condolences and all that shit.
Stallone had a soft spot for Rourke, who would later show up in the first Expendables movie when his career was doing much better, having been nominated for an Oscar for The Wrestler. The two of them actually have a great fight scene where, for a good while, Rourke beats the absolute piss out of Stallone before the Italian Stallion turns the tables, as happens in most of Sly's movies. All that said, it can't be denied that Get Carter is ultimately a pretty unnecessary film, with the 1971 Get Carter still great. The movie also suffers from a ludicrously reshot ending where Stallone, minus his goatee that he's been sporting the entire film, comforts Lee Cook's character, ending the film on an up note that runs contrary to the rest of the film.
I like the new look.
Nevertheless, this is still pretty decent stuff, although audiences at the time were not impressed, with it being saddled with a deadly D+ cinema score rating. It only made $14 million domestically and was barely released in Europe, meaning Sly's power as a foreign draw was all but gone. It did irreparable harm to his status as a leading man, but he wasn't alone in this regard, with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Steven Seagal all suffering major downturns in their popularity at the time, with JCVD and Seagal consigned to the DTV market for good. Only Sly and Arnold were ever able to fight their way back to the big screen, but that's a story for another time.
You Carter?
That's right. And you really don't want to know me.